Last week we left off with the Apostle Paul being delivered from the council that was made up of the high priest and the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And you'll remember that he used some wisdom and prudence to turn his enemies against themselves, against each other, recognizing that the Pharisees and the Sadducees had some major doctrinal disagreements, specifically about the resurrection and angels and spirits. And so Paul, in the middle of the council, says that I'm a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee, and of the hope of the resurrection I'm called in question. And that got the Pharisees arguing with the Sadducees. And before you know it, instead of fighting against Paul, they're fighting over him. They're trying to pull him in pieces, trying to get him to each of their respective camps. And the chief captain had to come in and rescue Paul again, as he had done before. So the Lord had delivered him, but this deliverance was very short-lived, because the very next day, a group of 40 Jews banded together and vowed that they would eat nor drink nothing until they had killed Paul. So they are not about to allow Paul to get off scot-free from persecution. Now they come up with this other scheme, and they really up the ante for themselves by binding themselves under this curse, under this vow, that they basically, it's either they kill Paul or else they die. Another, in a sense. It'd be interesting to find out what happened to the 40 of them, because as you know, Paul got away. I kind of doubt they all pined away in the street, for the next month or so while they died of starvation. But they probably had a way of somehow explaining that away, that they had their fingers crossed behind their back when they made the vow or something like that. So anyway, in Acts 23:12 through 13, it says, "And when it was day, certain of the Jews banded together and bound themselves under a curse, saying that they would neither eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. And there were more than 40 which had made this conspiracy." Now, today, I do have a lot to cover, so I don't want to go on a whole bunch of rabbit trails, but you always hear a lot of pejoratives today about conspiracy theories, right? Every time you bring up anything that you suggest that there might be something more to the story than what is being told to us, you believe in conspiracy theories. And if you say the word conspiracy to somebody today, ask them what the next word that comes to mind is, and I guarantee you they'll say theory, conspiracy theory. They don't like talking about conspiracies. They like relegating them to conspiracy theories, to say, oh, people are just theorizing about these conspiracies. Like conspiracies don't exist. It's just people coming up with these ideas about conspiracies. But just read through your Bible and you'll find numerous examples of the word itself being used of conspiracies. There were 40 men that made this conspiracy. There were literally 40 bad guys that got together in secret and colluded together and plotted to murder somebody. That actually happens, right? People don't believe that this stuff happens, but there actually are bad people that get together in secret and plot and scheme to do wicked things. That's a conspiracy by definition. So anybody that doesn't believe in conspiracies, like Pastor Mott said when he did that series years ago, if you don't believe in conspiracy, you don't believe in your Bible, because there are conspiracies in this world, certainly. Now, not every conspiracy that people think might have happened actually happened. I'm not saying that all of the theories are true, but there are plenty of real conspiracies out there. And this was one such one. It was certainly real for the Apostle Paul. I don't think whenever he sent his nephew to talk to the chief captain, he didn't say, "Oh, you're one of those conspiracy theory guys." Right? No, he believed him, thankfully. But we'll get to that in a second. So they conspired with the chief priests and elders to have Paul brought down to the council and to question him again. Just saying, oh, we in all of the ruckus, yesterday and with all the fighting and everything, we neglected to ask him some really crucial questions. So we just have a few more questions. So bring him down to the council. We'd like to interrogate him a little further. Well, the plan was, though, as soon as he comes down, they're going to catch him before he even gets to the meeting and kill him. That's the idea. Verses 14 and 15. And they came to the chief priests and elders and said, "We have bound ourselves under a great curse, that we will eat nothing until we have slain Paul. Now therefore, ye with the council signify to the chief captain that he bring him down unto you tomorrow, as though ye would inquire something more perfectly concerning him, and we, or ever he come near, are ready to kill him." So they're trying to trick the chief captain, in other words. The chief captain has saved Paul a couple of times already, and they're trying to dupe him into bringing Paul right into the trap that's going to end up in his death. Well, thankfully, Paul's nephew was hanging around, and we don't know why, but he was there, and he heard about this conspiracy, and he told the Apostle Paul about it in verse 16. It says, "And when Paul's sister's son heard of their lying in wait, he went and entered into the castle and told Paul." Now, this is one time when it's a good thing to be a tattletale. When you hear about a conspiracy to murder somebody, it's okay to tattle on them. It's okay to go and whisper that to somebody, and that's what he did. And Paul took this, obviously, this at face value, and he had one of the centurions get his nephew and talk to him, and then relay the message to the chief captain. There in verses 17 through 22. Then Paul called one of the centurions, that's a captain of a band, of a group of 100 men. He called one of the centurions unto him, and said, "Bring this young man unto the chief captain, for he hath a certain thing to tell him." So he took him and brought him to the chief captain, and said, "Paul the prisoner called me unto him, and prayed me to bring this young man unto thee, who hath something to say unto thee." Then the chief captain took him by the hand, and went with him aside privately, and asked him, "What is it? What is that thou hast to tell me?" Now from this, I don't know how old his nephew was, but I'm assuming he was a little boy. He took him by the hand. If he was a 30-year-old guy or something, he probably wanted to say, "Well, here, come here, let me take you by the hand." Right? Probably a little kid, right? So he took him by the hand. He comes over. He's like, "What do you have to tell me, boy?" And he goes on to explain it to him. Verse 20, "And he said, The Jews have agreed to desire thee that thou wouldest bring down Paul tomorrow into the council, as though they would inquire somewhat of him more perfectly. But do not thou yield unto them, for there lie in wait for him of them more than 40 men, which have bound themselves with an oath that they will neither eat nor drink till they have killed him. And now are they ready, looking for a promise from thee." So the chief captain let the young man depart. Well, there you go, young man. That doesn't necessarily mean he was a little kid, but anyway. So the chief captain let the young man depart, and charged him, "See thou tell no man that thou hast showed these things to me." So the chief captain doesn't want word to get out that he knows about the conspiracy, because then they're going to change their plans. So he wants them to continue with their plans so that he can thwart them. Now I find this is very interesting, because if you'll remember in the last sermon, at the end of the last, well, not even the end of the last chapter, just a few verses earlier than this, at the end of the last section there, the Lord told Paul that he would be with him, and that as he had testified in Jerusalem, he would testify in Rome also, there in verse 11. It says, "And the night following, the Lord stood by him, and said, Be of good cheer, Paul, for as thou hast testified of me in Jerusalem, so must thou bear witness also at Rome." Now, if the Lord tells you you must bear witness at Rome, what do you suppose you're going to do eventually? You're going to bear witness at Rome. It's going to happen. If the Lord says you must do this, then he's going to ensure that it happens. So there's no doubt that Paul knew that he was going to Rome. Paul believed that he was going to Rome. Paul knew it was God's will that he went to Rome. And yet they have this conspiracy to try to kill him. And Paul just doesn't sit back and say, "Well, the Lord told me I'm going to Rome. I don't got anything to worry about. I'll just let these conspirators go. Yeah, I'll let them take me down to the council, and something's going to work out. Or I don't have to worry about ratting them out or trying to save myself, because, the Lord said I'm going to Rome. So I'm just going to sit back and do absolutely nothing." That's not what Paul did. Paul did everything that he could to deliver himself from men who were plotting to kill him, even though he knew that he was ultimately going to be delivered from it. He knew he was going to Rome. They couldn't possibly kill him there. But knowing that he's going to be delivered, he still did everything that he possibly could to save himself. You always want to remember that. I have said this before. I'm going to say it again. We must trust God's promises of protection and provision, and then do everything he has commanded us to do to protect and provide for ourselves. Trust God's promises of protection and provision, and then do everything God has told you to do to provide and protect yourself. God does his, that sounds like an Arminian. I'm not talking about eternal salvation here. But when it comes to temporal salvation, God does his part, and then he expects you to do yours. That's not how eternal salvation works, but it is how temporal salvation works. And Paul's a good example of that. Do not tempt God by trusting, but not obeying. That's what you call tempting God. Saying, oh Lord, I trust you. You told me you're going to provide for my needs. I trust you. Now I'm going to sit on my butt and do nothing. That's tempting God. Right? If you trust God that he'll provide for your needs, then you do what he told you to do, and you work to provide for your own needs. Trust and obey. Not just trust. Trust and obey. You remember this song? Trust and obey. There's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey. There's a lot of truth in that song. And that's what Paul did. Paul trusted that God was going to take him to Rome. But you know what? Paul got off his butt, figuratively speaking, and told his nephew, told the chief captain, took great pains to make sure that he was going to be delivered from these men that were trying to kill him. He took matters into his own hands while trusting God. Always remember that. It's an error not to trust God and to try to do it all yourself. And it's also an error to say, I trust God and therefore I'm not going to do anything. Both are errors. Well, the chief captain ordered 2 centurions to make ready 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen to take Paul to Caesarea, to the governor Felix, in the middle of the night. So he took this one seriously, and this is just, this is a good display of prudent military tactics. Jesus said, you count the cost. If you're going out with 10,000 to meet an army with 20,000, you better see if you have enough to meet him. When you're going out to meet 40 men, you don't take 40 soldiers with you, or 20 soldiers. You don't even take 50 soldiers with you. If you're smart, you don't even take 80. You know what you do? You take 400, or 470 in this case. He more than 10 times them to make sure that he was going to win. That was prudence. Especially when you're a government official and you just have infinite resources at your disposal, and you're just spending other people's money, then you don't really have to worry about having a lack of resources. So here he goes with 470 soldiers to make sure that these 40 men weren't going to touch Paul. Verses 23 and 24. And he called unto him 2 centurions, saying, make ready 200 soldiers to go to Caesarea, and horsemen 70, that's 70, and spearmen 200 at the 3rd hour of the night. Now, if this was the Roman timing, I think I'm sure it's Roman timing because he's a Roman, and I believe the 3rd hour of the night would be the 3rd hour after midnight. So you're talking about middle of the night, like 3 o'clock in the morning. Even if you started at dusk, it's still getting well up into the middle of the night. He's not doing it in broad daylight, obviously. He's using night to his advantage. And he sends a letter with these soldiers for Felix, explaining to him Paul's situation there in verses 25 through 30. So he wants to get them. He needs to get Paul out of Jerusalem. Clearly, these men are not going to ever give Paul a fair shake. They wouldn't give him a fair shake in trial. Now they're just going to outright try to kill him. There's just no way that Paul is going to ever be saved or live any kind of a peaceful life here in Jerusalem. He had to get him out of there to get him to a higher court up in Caesarea, where the governor of Judea was residing. I think it was the governor of Judea. Apparently, Jerusalem was under his jurisdiction because Paul was being charged in Jerusalem. He sends him to Caesarea. Verses 25 through 30. So he gives him a letter explaining to him what's going on with Paul. And he wrote a letter after this manner. Claudius Lysias, unto the most excellent governor Felix, sendeth greeting. This man was taken of the Jews, and should have been killed of them. Then came I with an army, and rescued him, having understood that he was a Roman. And when I would have known the cause whereof they accused him, I brought him forth into their council. That's what we learned about last week. Whom I perceived to be accused of questions of their law, but to have nothing laid to his charge worthy of death or of bonds. And when it was told me how that the Jews laid wait for the man, I sent straightway to thee, and gave commandment that to his accusers also, to say before thee what they had against him. Farewell. So he's appealing up to a higher court. He's saying, hey, I told these guys, come up there, bring their case before thee. And that's what they're going to do. So Paul was safely taken to Caesarea, and Felix agreed to hear his case when his accusers got there, verses 31 through 35. Then the soldiers, as it was commanded them, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. I think the emphasis is on the second syllable there. Antipatris. On the morrow, they left the horsemen to go with him and return to the castle. So once they got him out of Jerusalem, then the other 400 went back, and it's just the 70 horsemen. They probably didn't want to walk the whole way to Caesarea. I wouldn't blame them. I wouldn't have wanted to either. Who, when they came to Caesarea, delivered the epistle to the governor, presented Paul also before him. And when the governor had read the letter, he asked of what province he was. And when he understood that he was of Cilicia, I will hear thee, said he, when thine accusers are also come. And he commanded him to be kept in Herod's judgment hall. So Paul is safe again for the time being. Paul has been delivered from the Jews by a Roman military officer and by a bunch of Roman soldiers. It's just interesting. It just depends on what the Lord wills, because an officer of the government and Roman soldiers nailed Jesus Christ to the cross, but an officer of the government and Roman soldiers saved the Apostle Paul. So it just depends on what the Lord's will is for your life. You may end up being delivered or persecuted by the exact same people. It just depends what the Lord has for you. So once he gets up to Felix the governor, Ananias the high priest is going to do as Felix said and come up there to accuse him. And apparently he didn't think that he was the best speaker, so he hires this jerk named Tertullus to come up there, this orator, you could say, if you wanted to pronounce the word correctly, this orator, not an orator, and to come up there and to accuse him eloquently. It always helps if you got a guy that can really schmooze you and make you feel good, make the judge feel good, and then, present this case against somebody, and because he's done such a nice job buttering up the judge just goes along with it. I'm sure that was the hope here anyway. Acts 24 and verse 1. And after 5 days, Ananias the high priest descended with the elders and with a certain orator named Tertullus, or Tertullus. Syllables on the emphasis on the second syllable there. Tertullus, who informed the governor against Paul. So they bring this guy, this orator, this good speaker, in other words, and he's going to make the accusation. Ananias, he was beaten by Paul once at his own game when he had the council, and Paul turned the Pharisees and Sadducees against each other. So this time he's bringing in the big guns. He doesn't want to be outdone by Paul again. He knows that Paul, though he was rude in speech, Paul was very logical and very powerful in his speech, and he wanted to make sure that he had somebody that was going to be able to stand up against him when it came to rhetoric. So Tertullus accused Paul of sedition, which was a capital crime, verses 2 through 5. It says, and when he was called forth, Tertullus began to accuse him, saying, seeing that by thee we enjoy great quietness, and that very worthy deeds are done unto this nation by thy providence, we accept it always, and in all places, most noble Felix, with all thankfulness. Now when a guy addresses you like that, you know he's setting a net for your feet, right? He that flattereth his neighbor spreadeth a net for his feet. Any guy that came up to me if I was a judge and spoke to me that way, I'd say, new attorney, get out of here. I don't trust this guy. Notwithstanding, that I be not further tedious unto thee, I pray thee that thou wouldest hear of thy clemency a few words. For we have found this man a pestilent fellow, and a mover of sedition among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. So he accuses him of sedition. A pestilent fellow. mover of sedition, ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. That's one name that the Christians went by in those days because Jesus was a Nazarene. He was from Nazareth. Now, sedition was a capital crime, meaning that it was worthy of the death penalty. I believe it was Barabbas who was in jail, in prison, for murder and sedition. Right? So he was being released because he was up for death, I suppose. And anyway, he was in prison, so it was definitely a crime that was worthy of prison, and I'm sure it was a capital crime. So that's why they accuse him with it. Of course, Paul never created any kind of sedition. Paul didn't try to incite riots or anything like that. There were plenty of riots that were incited because of him, but he wasn't the one inciting them. It was other people inciting them against him, like in Ephesus. You'll remember that. So Tertullus explained that the Jews would have judged him according to their law, but he was taken away by this chief captain Lysias with violence, verses 6 through 8, who also hath gone about to profane the temple. Remember, they accused him of that because they saw the Gentile, the Ephesian, there with him near the temple and just assumed that he took that Gentile into the temple, which he did not. Whom we took and would have judged according to our law, but the chief captain Lysias came upon us, and with great violence took him away out of our hands, commanding his accusers to come unto thee, by examining of whom thyself mayest take knowledge of all these things whereof we accuse him. And the Jews also assented, saying that these things were so. These are what you call lying witnesses. They are assenting that these things are so, which of course they were not. It's interesting here in just another side note, from the middle of verse 6 to the middle of verse 8, so the end of 6, all of 7, and the beginning of 8, that's all missing in the NIV. It's all gone. Took that section out of there for some reason. I don't know why. That's just one of the many verses that are missing out of the NIV. So, after this case was made against him, Paul gives his defense. He said he didn't do anything wrong, and really what the deal was is he's being called into question about the resurrection. Resurrection of Christ and the resurrection at the end of time, because Christ was the first fruits of it. So really, Paul gets right down to it and just says, these guys are lying. Here's why I'm really being, I'm being charged. It's because I've been preaching the resurrection of Jesus Christ, which is a historical fact seen by over 500 witnesses. He didn't say that, I said it, but you can read about it in 1 Corinthians 15 when he said that Christ was seen over 500 witnesses. That was their real beef, that he was preaching the resurrection of Christ. He gives his defense here in verses 10 through 21. Then Paul, after the governor had beckoned unto him to speak, answered, Forasmuch as I know that thou hast been of many years a judge unto this nation, I do the more cheerfully answer for myself. Now just compare what he said with what Tertullus said to the judge. Right? Tertullus, all these very flowery words and puffing him up and giving all this obsequious and flattering speech. And Paul just simply says, I know you've been a governor here for many years, and therefore I'm happy to speak for myself because you've been here and I can trust you. You've done a good job clearly for a long time, and I know you're going to be impartial. That was kind of the implication to all that. He just said one little sentence there. He didn't try to flatter him or butter him up or anything. Verse 11, Because that thou mayest understand that there are yet but 12 days since I went up to Jerusalem for to worship. And they neither found me in the temple disputing with any man, neither raising up the people, neither in the synagogues, nor in the city. Neither can they prove the things whereof they now accuse me. But this I confess unto thee, that after the way which they call heresy, so worship I the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and in the prophets. And I agree. I confess that to anybody, that after the way which they call heresy, what most people call heresy, most Christian people even, professing Christian people, what most of them call heresy, that's what I believe. The doctrine of election, the doctrine of predestination, the doctrine of Christ's second coming on the last day. All right, all those things. What they call heresy, that's what I believe. I worship the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and the prophets. Not just some of them, not just the ones that make you feel good, but all things. The fact that God hates sinners, I believe that too. I believe all things that are written in the book of the law and the prophets, what they call heresy. And have hope toward God, which they themselves also allow, that there shall be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and unjust. And herein do I exercise myself to have always a conscience void of offense toward God and toward men. Now, after many years, I came to bring alms to my nation and offerings. He didn't come to bring a revolution. He didn't come to bring a riot. He came to bring alms to the nation, a gift, giving to God in the temple, and offerings. Whereupon certain Jews from Asia found me purified in the temple, neither with multitude nor with tumult, who ought to have been here before thee, and object if they had aught against me. Or else, let these same here say, if they have found any evil doing in me while I stood before the council. Except it be for this one voice that I cried standing among them, touching the resurrection of the dead, I am called in question by you this day. That's interesting. He says, I didn't create a tumult, I didn't create a multitude, I didn't do anything. If the people in Jerusalem say I did that, they ought to be here. They ought to be here as eyewitnesses saying that I created this tumult, that I profaned the temple. Bring them here. Bring the witnesses. And furthermore, these men that are here, that are accusing me, that were at the council, ask them if I said anything that made me guilty at the council. The only thing I said at the council is that I believe in the resurrection. And the resurrection I'm called in question. That's the only thing I said at the council. And then that created an uproar, but I didn't say anything wrong. All I did was say I believed in the resurrection, and they're the ones that created the uproar. He didn't bother to tell them that he did so because he knew the Pharisees and Sadducees disagreed about that. You don't have to tell them everything, right? Well, when Felix heard about the resurrection, then he was going to defer his... He knew about the resurrection of Christ. He knew some about the Christian doctrine. And he decided to defer his judgment until Lysias, the chief captain, could come there and testify. Because the chief captain sent all the soldiers from Jerusalem to Caesarea to take Paul. He didn't go himself. So he's the one that really had an eyewitness testimony to the things that happened down there. And he could most definitely either condemn or exonerate Paul. So Felix wants to hear what Lysias has to say in verse 22. And when Felix heard these things, having more perfect knowledge of that way, he deferred them and said, when Lysias the chief captain shall come down, I will know the uttermost of your matter. Now, unless I've missed something here, I don't think Lysias ever came down, because Paul spent the next 2 years there in house arrest. Essentially, it wasn't. He was bound, but he was able to have some liberty, so he was treated pretty well. And I don't think Lysias ever came up, and I don't know why that is. I have a feeling. Well, I probably do know why it is, actually. Maybe the message never got to him. Maybe he told the high priest, hey, have Lysias come up. And the high priest is like, yeah, right, I'm not having Lysias come up. I don't know what happened. But anyway, it doesn't appear that Lysias ever made it up there. So Felix kept Paul in custody, but he did let his friends come and minister to him in verse 23. It says, and he commanded a centurion to keep Paul and to let him have liberty, and that he should forbid none of his acquaintance to minister or come unto him. So he recognizes that Paul's a good man. I'm guessing he believed Paul. He probably didn't believe these other liars. He probably believed Paul. He didn't have enough evidence to absolutely rule that Paul was innocent, right? But it sounds like if he'd have really thought that Paul was the monster they made him out to be, he wouldn't have let his acquaintance come to him. He wouldn't have let his friends come to him. He would have treated him roughly, but he treated him pretty well there. So that's just a good lesson to remember when you're standing before the authorities or your persecutors. A soft answer turneth away wrath, but grievous words stir up anger. So you want to remember the soft answer approach. Well, Felix had Paul come and preach to him, but when Paul started reasoning about righteousness and judgment and what was the other thing? Righteousness and judgment and temperance. That disturbed Felix, and he didn't want to hear about it anymore in verses 24 and 25. And after certain days, when Felix came with his wife Drusilla, which was a Jewess, that might explain why he had some understanding of that way. His wife was a Jew, so he probably was kind of in tune to what was happening down there in Jerusalem and all the talk of Jesus and the Christians and the Jews and all that stuff. So that's probably why he had some knowledge of that. He sent for Paul and heard him concerning the faith in Christ. And as he reasoned of righteousness, temperance, and judgment to come, Felix trembled and answered, Go thy way for this time, when I have a convenient season, I will call for thee. This tells you a little something about the Apostle Paul. If you were in prison, and the man that was holding you in prison, the governor, came to hear the gospel, would you reason with him about righteousness, temperance, and judgment to come? Or would you tell him how God loves everybody, and God loves you, oh Governor Felix, and God wants what's best for your life, and he just wants you to be a good boy, and if you just do what God says, he's going to bless you, and you're going to be rich and powerful. The Joel Osteen gospel. Paul didn't give him any of that stuff. Paul reasoned with him of righteousness, temperance, telling him, you better control your passions, governor, and judgment to come. And if you don't get your act cleaned up, you're going to hell. How about that? Paul obviously was much more concerned about saying the truth than he was about getting out of prison, wasn't he? That's a good example for us. Now, he also probably saw through Felix's ruse, because what Felix really hoped for is that Paul would bribe him to let him go free from prison. Verse 26. He hoped also that money should have been given him of Paul, that he might loose him, wherefore he sent for him the oftener and communed with him. He was hoping Paul would pay him off. Paul would bribe him. And he sent for him the oftener. He just figures, maybe he'll change his mind. He sits there in prison for a week or two. Maybe he's getting tired of it. He calls for him again. And he says, hey, you're going to go to hell if you don't clean up your act. All right, get out of here. I don't want to hear that again. Call him back in a month. Maybe he's changed his mind. Same thing. You better stop drinking so much. You better stop fornicating. Temperance. Go away. I'll talk to you again. This keeps coming back. Hopefully, maybe he'll pay me off this time. Right? He called for him the more often, but Paul wasn't gonna back down. So Paul remained in prison for 2 years for the remainder of Felix's term. Verse 27. But after 2 years, Porcius Festus came into Felix's room, and Felix, willing to show the Jews a pleasure, left Paul bound. Typical politician, right? Just, if it'll make the Jews happy, we'll keep this innocent guy in prison, for another who knows how many years. It's interesting here, this is just a quick side note. It says there that Paul was given liberty. It says that in verse 24. So he commanded a centurion to keep Paul and let him have liberty. And he was able to have his acquaintance come to him and so on. And then it says he left him bound. So you know what that tells me? You can be bound and yet have liberty. You can be bound and have some freedom of movement within a restricted sense. Now why does that matter? Because you know what it says of Satan at the end of time? Not at the end. It doesn't, not at the end of time. During the 1,000 years in Revelation 20, it says Satan shall be bound. Now people say, well, if what we say is true and Satan was bound at the resurrection of Christ and he's not loosed until near the end of time, if he's bound, how can he do all this evil in the world? Well, right there's your answer. Paul was bound, but he had liberty. Satan's bound. He can't deceive the nations any longer. He can't mass deceive all the nations of the world like he had prior to the coming of Christ. Every nation on earth was in complete spiritual darkness except for one. He can't do that again. That's what he was bound for, that he should deceive the nations no more. But he still has freedom and liberty to go about and to cause all kinds of trouble and tempt the saints and accuse them and so on. So you can be bound and yet have liberty. Anyway, back to this story here with Paul. Being a good man, Paul was not willing to bribe Felix to get out of jail, but he rather endured his confinement for 2 years. Think about that. He chose to stay in prison for 2 years rather than give a bribe or rather than even try to tell Felix what he wanted to hear and maybe get on his good side. It's better to stay in jail than it is to sin or to compromise your principles. Better to stay in jail than to sin or compromise your principles. Paul's a good example there for us. Well, it says there he stayed there for 2 years until Festus came in Felix's room, which I'm assuming there was a changing of the guard there in the governorship. And now Festus is the governor instead of Felix. And so the Jews are going to try again. They try to convince the new governor to send Paul to Jerusalem so that they can kill him on the way. They didn't get anywhere with the old governor, so they figured they'd try it again. It's kind of like when you have a substitute teacher in school. You know with the teacher you can't get away with anything. The teacher's already established the authority. The substitute comes in and all of a sudden you try your old antics again just to see if you can push him or he or she's a pushover. Well, that's what they're trying to do here with Festus. Thankfully it didn't work. So the high priest and the Jewish leadership, they talk to Festus when he comes down to Jerusalem. Chapter 25 and verse 1. Now, when Festus was come into the province, after 3 days he ascended from Caesarea to Jerusalem. And that's when the high priest and the Jewish leadership accused Paul before him. And they tried to persuade him to bring him down to Jerusalem. Verses 2 and the first part of 3. Then the high priest and the chief of the Jews informed him against Paul, and besought him and desired favor against him that he would send for him to Jerusalem. What they wanted to do, of course, was to kill him. They were gonna kind of do. They're just playing out of the old playbook. Remember, the old playbook was bring him down to the council, and we've got these men waiting to kill him. Well, now bring him down to Jerusalem. We've got these men waiting to kill him, and that's what they were trying to do. It says they were laying in wait to kill him. But Festus answered that Paul should be kept at Caesarea, and that he himself would depart shortly thither. So I don't know, it doesn't really say the reason why Festus decided not to bring him to Jerusalem. It could have been for his own selfish reasons, or it could have been that he smells a rat here and he sees there's just something's not right about this. These guys are trying to get him to be brought down here. Why don't you just come up there like Felix had said before? Come up there, bring your accusations. So for whatever reason, he says, nope, we're not bringing him to Jerusalem. You guys can come up to Caesarea. Verse 5, let them therefore, said he, which among you are able, go down with me and accuse this man if there be any wickedness in him. And maybe he just wanted to give Paul a fair trial. Maybe he sees that the deck is stacked against him here clearly. Let's bring him up there. Or let's bring you guys up there. We don't really know the reason. But we do know that Paul's life was again spared because of the decision of this governor. And this is an excellent example of the king's heart being in the hand of the Lord, and he turneth it whithersoever he will. Proverbs 21 and verse 1. Just remember, nobody is outside the control of God. God can turn that governor's heart just like that. And he did. Well, after 10 days, Festus returned to Caesarea, and the next day he sat in judgment of Paul. Verse 6, Acts 25:6. And when he had tarried among them more than 10 days, he went down unto Caesarea, and the next day, sitting on the judgment seat, commanded Paul to be brought. I just think it's interesting. I've noticed this a couple times here in this passage. When he goes to Caesarea, he goes down to Caesarea. When he goes to Jerusalem, he goes up to Jerusalem. Do you know what direction Caesarea is from Jerusalem? It's north, right? But it says he goes up to Jerusalem when he's going south, and he goes down to Caesarea when he's going north. It's always said in the Bible you're going up to Jerusalem because that's the city of God. That's Mount Zion. That's God's place. And when you go there, you're always going up. Regardless of what direction you're heading, you're always going up. So when you come to the house of God, you go up to the house of God. It doesn't matter if you're coming from Lathrop or Lawson or wherever's north of here. You're going up to Excelsior Springs when you're coming to the house of God. And you just pay attention sometime as you're reading through the Bible when people are going to Jerusalem. And it'll always say they go up to Jerusalem regardless of where they're coming from. It's pretty interesting. So he goes down to Caesarea, north, and gets up there. He gets down there, and he's going to sit in judgment. And so the Jews come along with him, and they level many grievous charges against Paul, which they could not prove. Verse 7. It says, "And when he was come, the Jews which came down from Jerusalem," see, there you go again, came down from Jerusalem, stood round about and laid many and grievous complaints against Paul, which they could not prove. They're being false accusers. If these men were being held to the standard of the law of Moses, they'd be in big trouble. Because in the law of Moses, if you made a false accusation against somebody and it turned out not to be true, you got the punishment that they were going to get. Now, they're under Roman rule, so maybe the rules weren't the same, and they are able to get away with a lot more than they would have been had it been under Jewish rule, under God's rule. Well, Paul again proclaims his innocence in verse 8. "Well, he answered for himself, neither against the law of the Jews, neither against the temple, nor yet against Caesar have I offended anything at all." Now, sometimes it pays to just make a very short declaration of your innocence. Jesus didn't even make a declaration of his innocence at all at one point. He answered never a word. And here, Paul just gives one sentence. He basically says, I didn't do it. I didn't do anything against Caesar. I didn't do anything against the law. I didn't do anything against anybody. And he just left it at that. Because sometimes if you go on and on and on, it's like the Shakespearean play where it says, the lady doth protest too much, methinks. You start to make people wonder, what's this guy have to hide? I mean, he's very defensive, and he's really coming to his aid, or really coming to his defense, and he's really trying to convince me that he didn't do anything wrong. And you think, why is he so uptight if he really is innocent? Because if you're really innocent, what do you have to worry about? Just remember that. Paul just gives one little sentence there. Well, Festus, being a typical politician, tried to placate the Jews by asking Paul if he would go to Jerusalem to be tried. Verse 9. "But Festus, willing to do the Jews a pleasure, answered Paul and said, Wilt thou go up to Jerusalem, and there be judged of these things before me?" This guy is such a sleazeball, because he can clearly see if Paul was guilty, he wouldn't be sending him back to Jerusalem, to a lower court, in other words. Imagine you make it the whole way up to the Supreme Court, and they think you're guilty, and then they say, well, go back down to the district court. I mean, that doesn't make any sense, right? If he thought he was guilty, he would have judged him guilty. But he sees he's innocent, but just to make the Jews happy, he says, you want to go back down to Jerusalem? Get your day in court there? Well, Paul wisely wasn't going to fall for that one, because Paul had some sense, and he could foresee the evil, which it wouldn't take a whole lot in that situation to know if I go back to Jerusalem, they're going to kill me, one way or the other. So he declined to go to Jerusalem, and he appealed rather to Caesar's court. He appealed to the Supreme Court in that system. Acts 25, 10 through 11. "Then said Paul, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat, where I ought to be judged. To the Jews have I done no wrong, as thou very well knowest." That's a pretty bold statement to make to the governor. I've done nothing wrong, and you know it. Festus, you know I've done nothing wrong. I am not going to Jerusalem. Festus doesn't even deny it. Right? Yeah, he knew it. "For if I be an offender, or have committed anything worthy of death, I refuse not to die. But if there be none of these things whereof these accuse me, no man may deliver me unto them. I appeal unto Caesar." And he could do that because he was a Roman citizen. Just another rabbit to chase. I got time. He says, if I be an offender or have committed anything worthy of death, I refuse not to die. Paul was affirming the death penalty. He was affirming the righteousness of the death penalty. He said, if I have done anything worthy of death, he would accept it. He would accept his death because he deserved it. Because in the Old Testament, going the whole way back to, let me just give you a verse here, going the whole way back to Genesis, I think it's chapter 9, after the flood, the Lord instituted the death penalty. I haven't preached on the death penalty. Actually, I haven't preached on that topic alone ever, I don't think. I'm sure I've mentioned it in sermons, but one of these days I probably should. But back in Genesis chapter 9, in verse 5, he says, "And surely your blood of your lives will I require. At the hand of every beast will I require it. And at the hand of man, at the hand of every man's brother will I require the life of man. Whosoever sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed, for in the image of God made he man." So that was the first instance of the death penalty. And you know what happened in the earth before there was a death penalty? You can read about it over in chapter 6, when it says in verse 11, "The earth was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence." You know what happens when man's natural inclinations go unchecked and there is no punishment for it, or no severe punishment for it? The earth is full of violence. That's why God instituted the death penalty, to rid the earth of that kind of violence. Of course, the death penalty then continued on through the law of Moses, and I could give you many, many examples of that, but you read through Leviticus, it's in the teens there, I think 18, 19, something like that, in Deuteronomy, you'll read a whole bunch of lists of people that deserve the death penalty for incest, for certain types of fornication, for adultery, for sodomy, for breaking the Sabbath, being a witch, all kinds of stuff merited the death penalty under the law of Moses. Then you come to the New Testament, and though there is not a death penalty specified, where it doesn't say you do this, you're physically put to death, but we have an affirmation of the death penalty, which was given prior to the law of Moses, and which was in the law of Moses. We have that affirmation by the Apostle Paul here, when he says he refused not to die if he did anything worthy of death. And Jesus also quoted the law of Moses, and he said, "He that curseth father or mother, let him die the death." So Jesus was affirming the death penalty as well from the law of Moses. That was not one of the parts of the law of Moses that was done away with, because really it wasn't unique to the law of Moses. It preceded the law of Moses. So the death penalty is still in vogue here, or at least it should be. And you know why we have, probably one reason why we have so much violence in this country, and especially in certain parts of this country? It's because the sentence against evil works are not executed speedily. If they even have a death penalty, which a lot of these blue states don't, if they have one, a person sits on death row for decades sometimes and never is put to death. And when you do things like that and people know that there is not going to be a swift and sure punishment for wickedness, they are emboldened to do wickedness. In Ecclesiastes 8 and verse 11 it says, "Because sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily, therefore the hearts of the sons of men is fully set in them to do evil." We ought to have a death penalty, and it ought to be executed speedily. That's the way it used to be done. When you were tried before a jury of your peers and you were found guilty, you went out and you were hanged like that day. Right? What's the reason? What's the purpose of waiting? Especially if it's a cut and dry case. You have 10 witnesses that saw you kill somebody. Hang them. Right then and there. Give them a trial and hang them. Or firing squad or whatever. So anyway, that was a little bit of a rabbit to chase, but like I said, I haven't talked about that topic for a long time. So Paul appeals to Caesar's court. He's not going to go back to Jerusalem. You would be a fool to go back there. He wisely used his rights as a citizen and the legal system to his advantage, as he had done previously. And I'm not going to read these verses because we've already been over them, but you remember in Acts 16, 37 and 38, when Paul was in jail in Philippi, and they said, you're free, go ahead. And he's like, no, you've beaten us uncondemned as Roman citizens. You tell them to come here and let us out. He appealed to his citizenship there. And he also appealed to his citizenship with Lysias, the chief captain, when he was binding him down and about ready to beat him, to scourge him. And he says, is it lawful to beat a Roman citizen uncondemned? And he said, wait a minute, I didn't know he was a Roman citizen. So this is at least the third time that he's appealed to his Roman citizenship to be delivered. So there's certainly a time for that. It says in Proverbs 22 and verse 3 that a prudent man foreseeth the evil and hideth himself, but the simple pass on and are punished. Paul was foreseeing the evil and hiding himself. So Festus granted Paul's request to be tried before Caesar. In verse 12, Acts 25 and verse 12, says, Then Festus, when he had conferred with the council, answered, Hast thou appealed unto Caesar? Unto Caesar shalt thou go. So Paul got his request, and he was spared from death again by exercising wisdom and prudence this time. Now he does go before one more, and not really a trial, but he had a hearing before King Agrippa in Acts chapter 26. And I'm not going into that because I'm just covering the times where they're trying to kill or persecute Paul, and he wasn't really being he wasn't being persecuted there, so I'm not going through that section. But it's interesting, once Agrippa heard him, he said to Festus afterwards, you know what, if he hadn't appealed to Caesar, he would have probably been let go. That was Agrippa's opinion, for one thing, but okay, he would have been let go, and then what? Taken back to Jerusalem, or killed by the Jews or something. So getting him off to Rome was probably the best place that he could have been. So it ended up being a wise move. Okay, so that finally takes us, almost to the end of the Apostle Paul's sufferings. It takes us to the end of his persecution. Well, actually, I can't even say that because he does get killed at the very end. It takes us through most of his persecution. Then we're going to have him being shipwrecked next week, and finally being put to death in Rome, and then the series is going to be over. But let's just sum up the lessons that we've learned in the last, has it been 5 weeks now, learning about the life of the Apostle Paul. So lesson number 1. The more greatly we will be used by God, the more greatly we will suffer. You remember that was said of Paul when Ananias went to baptize him, and the Lord told him that he would show him how great things he must suffer. He was going to be sent to the Jews and also to the Gentiles. He was going to be used greatly, but he was going to suffer greatly. A pastor friend of mine I just went to visit the other day, he had torn his Achilles tendon completely, and he had surgery, and he's in a lot of pain. And he said something that I hadn't ever heard before, and I thought it was really good. It was something to the effect of, there's no testimony without being tested. In order to have a testimony, you have to be tested. If you've never been tested, you're not going to have a testimony, in other words. So I thought that was pretty good. Lesson number 2. Persecution and affliction will often happen to Christians soon after their conversion. This happened to Paul. He was immediately persecuted and hounded right afterwards. This happened to Jesus, his first public sermon, and they tried to kill him right afterwards. It says in Hebrews chapter 10 that after your illumination, you endured a great fight of afflictions. Right? So that's typical to be tried shortly after one's conversion. And I've seen this happen time and again with Christians. Lesson number 3. Those who are zealous for the faith and effective at defending it will be persecuted by the enemies of Christ. Now, if you're not zealous for the faith, you probably have nothing to worry about. If you're lukewarm, you got nothing to worry about. You're not going to be persecuted, so just take life easy. You'll be all right. Maybe you'll be all right. Maybe you're a reprobate, and you have no evidence of grace in your heart. So when I say you'll be all right, I'm saying that tongue in cheek. I recommend that you be zealous in the faith, that you have all the evidence of salvation that you can. But if you're zealous, you'll be persecuted, and especially if you're effective at defending the faith. Because those are the people that Satan really hates. Somebody that can effectively defend the faith and shut the mouths of the gainsayers. Satan really doesn't like people like that. If you bumble around, you can't really remember the verses, and you get through with the argument and nobody was really convinced and whatever, Satan doesn't really care about that. But if you can effectively give him the verse and hold his feet to the fire and convince that gainsayer where he's got nothing to say, expect persecution, because Satan is going to be after you. Lesson number 4. There is a time to flee and evade government authorities who are persecuting you. And Paul's a great example of that. Damascus, he got let down through the window in the wall in the basket. And how many times did he evade the Jews? I mean, he evaded them there with Lysias, the chief captain, with some help, but he numerous times, he was evading people that were trying to kill him, or government authorities in some cases. Lesson number 5. When we flee persecution, we must do so in order to keep preaching the gospel, contending for the faith, and worshiping God, not to hide in fear. And we saw that so many times. Every time there was a persecution raised against Paul and he went to the next place, he didn't go there to hide out and not be found. He went right to the synagogue and he started preaching again. Now there may come a day when we have to flee from the Oaks. We had to, flee before, right? We weren't allowed to be here. But there may come a day when we have to flee, when we can't meet here anymore because it has become illegal because of a lockdown or because of some other reason. But we are not, at least I'm not, and I hope you'll follow me, we are not going to go back to our houses unless we're going there for church, right? We are going to go to a place to meet for worship, wherever that happens to be. So if we flee, it is to worship another place. It is not to go hide out in our homes and cower in fear. Lesson number 6. God will give us seasons of peace between seasons of persecution. You remember, I think it was when Paul got to Corinth. He was there for a year and a half. And there were other times, when he was in prison, not the funnest place to be, but when he was in prison there, which we just read about for 2 years, his friends were able to come to him. It wasn't a bad situation, it doesn't sound like. It certainly beat, the Jews trying to pull you in pieces and stone you and, things like that. So, and not just the Jews, the Lycaonians, I think, stoned him. So it beat all that. So God gives you seasons of reprieve amidst seasons of persecution. Lesson number 7. Persecution should not discourage us, but rather embolden us. Persecution should not discourage us, but rather embolden us. Let me give you a verse. I just thought about it this morning. Philippians 1, 13 through 14. This is why I think that Satan has really kind of backed off from the persecution route. For a lot of history, he's backed off from the persecution because it's just not effective. When you persecute Christians, they should anyway, become more zealous. And it increases the faith. When they persecuted the church in Jerusalem, and it said they were scattered everywhere, and they went preaching the gospel everywhere. So yeah, the church was scattered, but churches were started all over the place because of that. The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, as they say. Well, anyway, in Philippians 1, 13 through 14, this is Paul writing. He says, so that my bonds in Christ, that's referring to his shackles where he's bound in prison, so that my bonds in Christ are manifest in all the palace and in all other places. And many of the brethren in the Lord, waxing confident by my bonds, are more bold to speak the word without fear. This is one of the prison epistles. He's writing this from Rome in prison, and his imprisonment didn't make these other Christians flee and be scared and shut up and self-censor and things like that. It made them more bold. And I get that. I totally get that. When Tim Stevens and James Coates were put in prison, that didn't make me want to meet for church less when we weren't allowed to. It made me want to meet for church more. Maybe that was after we weren't allowed to. I think it was after. But anyway, the point is, when that happened to them, I was way more emboldened to want to continue to meet for church regardless of lockdowns or anything else when those guys got put in prison. It didn't make me afraid. It made me more courageous. And that's what happened to these men here when they saw Paul in prison. That's why it's so important to take a stand, because one little Christian taking a stand can make a big difference in a lot of lives around him. When the lockdowns first happened, there was some charismatic down in Louisiana that wasn't going to close his church, and he didn't care. And granted, I don't have anything in common with that guy. I'm sure his doctrine is totally screwed up. But that, and I don't even know who he was, I didn't know anything about him. All I knew is he didn't close his church when they said close your church. And that gave me courage to do the same thing. Because that was way back in the very beginning. So you never know who you might embolden just by simply taking a stand. Lesson number 8. Sometimes religious people will team up with heathens to persecute God's people. And that happened numerous times where the Jews stirred up the Gentiles. They all got together. Or sometimes, I don't think I have this one in here, sometimes religious people that are diametrically opposed to each other will put their differences aside to persecute you as well, like the Pharisees and Sadducees. Lesson number 9. We must never be weary in well-doing. How easy would it have been for Paul to just say, I'm an old man. Or even if he wasn't an old man, I feel like an old man. I have been going all over the world, literally, all over the known world, and I've been persecuted from place to place to place. I got all these scars on me. I've been beaten with rods. I've been stoned. I've been shipwrecked. I'm just so tired. I'm done. I'm just going back to Antioch. I'm going back to Tarsus, and I'm just going to retire. I'm done. Nope, not Paul. He was not going to be weary in well-doing. He just kept pressing on and never quit. And we have to do the same thing. Lesson number 10. The Lord is able to deliver us from all types of persecution. Whether it's Jews or Gentiles, whether it's government persecution, whatever it is. Whether it's conspiracies, whether it's stonings, whether it's lying in wait for you, whether it's trying to trick you, whatever. God can deliver you out of all kinds of persecutions. Lesson number 11. We should remain joyful during persecution and continue to praise God even when suffering. Remember Paul and Silas in that Philippian jail? There they are. They've been stripped of their clothes. They've had many stripes laid upon them. They're probably bloody, bruised, in pain, feet in the stocks, and singing hymns. Always want to remain joyful during persecution because you're blessed if you're persecuted. That's what Jesus said. Jump for joy. For so persecuted they the prophets which were before you. Lesson number 12. God can use civil magistrates to deliver us from persecution. He did. He used the town clerk, I forget that guy's name in Acts 19 in Ephesus. He used him. He used Lysias. He was a centurion. Festus, Felix. Right? He used numerous times. He used civil magistrates to deliver Paul from persecution. He can do the same thing for you. Lesson number 13. Persecution sometimes arises when the preaching of the gospel threatens the financial empires of the ungodly. That was Acts chapter 19 in Ephesus with Demetrius the silversmith. You remember that. Sirs, you know that by this craft we have our wealth. What was his real reason for persecuting Paul and the other apostles? Because it was going to cost him financially. Why did they persecute and beat and imprison Paul in Philippi? Because he cast out the devil out of that girl that was doing the soothsaying, and the hope of their gains was gone, it was said. So if you get really effective in preaching against celebrating Christmas and the pagan holidays, and I mean really effective, and you start having mass conversions in the area, and all of a sudden Walmart and Target and all the stores around here in town and all their business starts to dry up because, you know why they call it Black Friday, don't you? Because they're in the black until Black Friday. Or in the red or whatever. I think they're in the red until Black Friday. That's what it is. They don't make any money. Retail doesn't make any money until Black Friday. Black Friday and then the rest of the year makes up for all the losses that they had the rest of the year. Well, you start preaching and getting thousands of people in this town and the surrounding area to stop celebrating Christmas, and all of a sudden they're going to want to be starting to investigate the Excelsior Springs Church and see what's going on here and what are these pestilent fellows and movers of sedition among all the people and, you know, whatever. Of course, there's not a snowball's chance that's going to happen, but you get the point, right? People would get up in arms if you hit them in the pocketbook. let's see, where was I? Lesson number 14. God will sometimes use wise friends to deliver us from trouble or death. He did this in Ephesus when Paul wanted to go into the theater and his friends wouldn't allow him to go in. That would have been a really bad move. He could have been stomped to death, thronged to death, who knows what. You get into a crowd and it's pretty easy to be killed. That was because of his wise friends. His friends also snuck him off. I think it was when he was in Thessalonica and they snuck him off to Berea, or if it was Berea and they snuck him off to Greece, to Athens. It was one of those two places or both where his friends really helped him to get out. So having wise friends can be used for your deliverance as well. Lesson number 15. We must be prudent and foresee evil coming and be flexible and willing to change our plans in order to experience deliverance. You remember when Paul went back through Macedonia. He had gone through Macedonia, he gets down to Greece, he had planned just to sail down to Syria, and he finds the Jews lying in wait for him, and he goes the whole way back through Macedonia. Took a lot more time, a lot more energy, but he foresaw the evil and realized that he had to hide himself and he had to change his plans, and sometimes you have to do that. Lesson number 16. Our enemies will make false accusations against us in order to persecute us. Remember when they went before Felix and the orator there made all these accusations, he's a pestilent fellow, mover of sedition and so on, and then they laid all these grievous charges to him in front of Festus, none of which they could prove. They did the same thing to Jesus. So just don't be shocked if someday you're persecuted for your faith, whether it's at work or whether it's somewhere else, and all of a sudden people just start saying all these things about you and just making up lies, and don't be blown away by that, because that can happen. Lesson number 17. The Lord can use government officials and soldiers to deliver us, as he did there with Paul. Lesson number 18. It can be wise to appeal to our civil rights when persecuted, because Paul was able to be delivered on at least 3 different occasions, appealing to his civil rights. I said it can be wise because sometimes I don't think it is the best way to go. I think sometimes the best thing to do is to appeal to your biblical God-given rights and make them argue with the Bible. You get dragged into court for homeschooling your kids or any number of things like that, you make them argue with the Bible. You say, God gave me the responsibility to train up these children. You give them the verse and you make that lawyer argue with the Bible. They don't want to argue with the Bible. They'll want to argue legal arguments. And all you just say is, the Bible says, period. You want to throw me in jail? Throw me in jail. Here's what the Bible says. And if you throw me in jail, you better kiss the Son, because you're going to be in trouble with God. I think a lot of times that's a better argument. Because you start to argue Constitution stuff, and those lawyers know how to get around the Constitution a lot better than you know the Constitution. They don't know it. They probably never even read it. But they know case law, and they know all these case laws, which says that the Constitution doesn't mean what it says. So good luck arguing the Constitution when you have 200 years of history of justices saying the Constitution doesn't mean what it says. So, yeah, good luck with that. Lesson number 19. A wise Christian will perceive his enemies' weaknesses and exploit them to turn them against each other, like Paul did with the Pharisees and Sadducees. Now you gotta be wise and prudent to be able to do that. Number one, you have to know who your enemies are and know what they believe, and then you have to figure out a way that you can pit them against each other. I mean, this approach is not for dummies. I mean, this is difficult stuff. It's really hard to think fast on your feet like that and know your enemies and be able to figure out what you can say to, that's not an easy thing to do. Paul was a genius when it came to that. So, but it's something that we should all try to attain to, because that can be very effective. Lesson number 20. God can use our friends and others to thwart the plans of the wicked who would try to destroy us. Remember Paul's little nephew? I'm guessing he was a little tyke. I don't know. He's a young man, young guy anyway. And here, this young kid delivered Paul, or was used by God to help deliver Paul. So you never know who God could use to deliver you. All right, 2 more. Lesson number 21. If we behave in a godly and respectful manner, we may find favor in the sight of government officials and cause them to have mercy on us. Paul was respectful to Felix. He found mercy in Felix's eyes. He was respectful to Festus. He found mercy in Festus' eyes. He was respectful to Lysias, the chief captain. He found mercy in Lysias' eyes. So when you do that and you act respectfully, you're gonna win a lot more. You're gonna get how's it go? You're gonna get a lot more flies with honey than manure or something